Welcome back, guys. Last week you left me in Austria saying goodbye to Tristan and starting my solo travels in Europe with the next destination of Krakow in Poland. So let's get started.
I arrived into Krakow in the morning at 6 a.m. and I think the video speaks for itself. Look at that sunrise. This is what I'm talking about. The skies in Poland are unreal. Got to do a video of Krakow in the morning. So after a slightly stressful search for the apartment, I just conked out for like 2 hours I think, and then started an insane day of sightseeing, which I will run you through now.
I started off my solo adventures in Krakow in its old town, the entirety of which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Krakow Barbican was built in 1498 and was once part of the city's defensive walls. The St. Florian's Gate Tower dates to the 14th century. There is a wall of artwork next to the gate tower that stretches the whole length of one of the walls. A stroll down St. Florian's Street leads directly into the Krakow main market square, one of the largest medieval squares in all of Europe. Rising above the main market square are the mismatched towers of St. Mary's Basilica. The Polish Gothic red brick church dates to the 13th century. The wooden carved altarpiece is a national treasure of Poland, and you can see why. I have never seen a church like it. The colours, patterns and paintings everywhere made the place feel alive. The Town Hall Tower is 230 foot tall, leans 55 centimetres, and its basement was once a prison and a torture chamber. The Krakow Cloth Hall dates back to the 1300s. Goods like spices and wax were brought from the east and exchanged for local products like textiles and salt from the mine. Below the Cloth Hall is the RYNEK Underground, a fascinating museum detailing the history of the market in the Cloth Hall and the city history of Krakow. The museum is very visual and interactive, and actually used the original excavated wooden stalls they found during their archaeological digs. St. Adalbert's Church is a modest stone church where traders would go to pray. I really liked its understated beauty. I love how from the outside, the St. Francis of Assisi Church looks like just another church. It makes the inside all the more unexpected. The Art Nouveau paintings are stunningly beautiful. It was also the daily place of worship for Pope John Paul II. There's even a pew at the back of the church marked with a small plaque indicating where he sat. For lunch, I went to restaurant Honey Raspberry. I had an amazing traditional Polish mushroom soup, served in a bread bowl. Delish. The Church of St. Peter and Paul may seem a little less colourful, but this ornate Baroque church has another reason to go inside. In the basement there is a crypt, which is the burial place for some of the most famous Poles distinguished in the arts, science and culture. It's a little bit creepy down there, especially when you're by yourself and it becomes a bit of a maze with your only company being a coffin every now and then. WAWEL Castle, which sits atop WAWEL Hill, is made up of quite the higgledy-piggledy mix of buildings. The hill has been home to civilisations since the Old Stone Age, 3.3 million years ago. It has amazing views over Krakow. The castle has been expanded, destroyed and changed hands of power several times, so that's resulted in an amazing blend of architectural styles, including medieval, Renaissance and Baroque. Today, the castle is a UNESCO heritage site and a museum. I then walked back to the main square and saw the Eros Bendato bronze statue. It was part of an art exhibition from 2003 and was then gifted to the city. It's one of the most modern sites in the Old Market Square. And that brought my first day in Krakow to an end.
And on the second day, I decided I would look more into the history of Krakow. I'm a history student, and I actually hadn't searched up any of it beforehand, nor had I really come across it beforehand. But Krakow has an amazingly rich history, especially during World War II. Poland basically was invaded from both sides at the beginning of World War II. Half of it by Germany and then half of it by the USSR. And Krakow ended up having one of the biggest Jewish ghettos of the whole Holocaust. So I knew I wanted to see that as well. But I started off going to the Galicia Museum of Jewish History, which was absolutely fantastic. And I know I'm going to talk about it later, so I won't go into it too much more. But while I was there, I was seeing these pictures about Krakow, about the Jewish ghetto, which I knew nothing about at that time, about a concentration camp that had been in Krakow that again I had known nothing about. So I made a list of all the places that I was seeing in the photos and added them to my itinerary of the day, and I'm so glad I did. That day was so brutal and traumatic actually, but I'm really glad I did it. I think it was everything that I did needed to be seen and experienced in order for me to feel like I was honouring it somehow. And I think that's what travelling is about. You need to experience all sides of a culture and all sides of a city's history, and this made up a really, really big part of Krakow's history, so I think it would be wrong to have skipped out on it altogether, and I'm really glad I didn't.
I started off the morning in KAZIMIERZ, a district known as the Jewish Quarter. Even though the Jews that lived there were moved into the Jewish ghetto in 1941, and much of the area was destroyed during Nazi occupation, the district has retained much of its Jewish history and culture. My first stop is the Galicia Jewish Museum. I found their home-to-home exhibition particularly striking. It documents the incredible 3-year journey of a Jewish-Polish family from Krakow, who were exiled from Poland during World War II. The mother of the Pisek family, Irina, kept a diary during their journey and, years after the war, drew pictures to accompany their stories. They flee Krakow in 1939, moving to Zamość and then Lviv. In Lviv, they are forced out in a raid during the night, put on a locked train carriage with 50 to 70 people and sent off into the unknown. After 14 days of abysmal conditions on the train, with the dead carried out each night, they arrive in Siberia, where they are forced to work 8-hour days in -40 degrees for over a year. They are then granted amnesty by the Russian forces and told there will be a train on the tracks 27 kilometers away that will leave Siberia. They walked overnight to get to the train, not knowing where it would take them. Again they got on a train, this time for 5 weeks, before arriving in Uzbekistan. After a short time there, they were ordered to leave and go to Turkmenistan, but her husband had fallen gravely ill. They had to make the heartbreaking decision to leave him behind and take the children. Irina and her children spent the next 3/4 of a year living in a refugee camp in Tehran. One day, there is a knock at the door, and her son walks in, holding her husband's hand. Miraculously, the father had made it from Russia and bumped into his son in the street in Tehran. The newly united family then headed to Israel. After several events along the way, they made it to Tel Aviv. The family remains there to this day. Almost all of their relatives who remained in occupied Poland were killed during the Holocaust. Their story is an amazing one that documents the journey of one Polish Jewish family, covering 12,000 kilometers to find a new home and safety. They were threatened, shot at, left to starve, left for dead. But in all their horrors, they never let go of their faith. After the museum, I happily stumbled across a Polish street food market and picked up an absolutely delicious traditional Polish maczankę krakowską. It only cost me the equivalent of €1. I crossed over Father BERNATEK'S bridge into another predominantly Jewish district of Podgorze. The modern bridge has these beautiful acrobatic figures on the cables that slightly move in the wind. Such a cool combination of sculpture and architecture. My first stop in Podgorze was the KRAKUS mound, the oldest structure in Krakow. The story goes that the man-made mound is the burial place of King KRAKUS, the founder of the city. A narrow path winds around the mound with a beautiful 360 view over the region. I actually got quite emotional standing up there and shed a couple of happy tears, proud of myself for embracing this adventure. During the Nazi occupation, the LIBAN quarry became a place of forced labour and death. Now, overgrown and strewn with rusting machinery, the quarry is abandoned and off limits. It had a very eerie feeling, and the sorrow of the place seemed to hang in the air. The BASILICA concentration camp in Krakow was used between 1942 until 1945, when it was liberated by the Red Army. It is estimated that about 150,000 people in all were inmates at this camp, the majority being Jews. About 8,000 prisoners were killed. While I was there, the sun came out and lit up the ground. This rocky ground I'm marking with my finger is one side of the roll call area of the camp. Today, this land is just a public park. I find that very unsettling, as all that's left to commemorate the tragedy of this land are these signs dotted around the huge area. In March 1941, the Nazis designated the Podgorze district as the Jewish ghetto, where Krakow's Jews were forced to live in cramped quarters behind walls until the entire population was liquidated 2 years later and sent to camps across Europe. There are 2 places in Podgorze where portions of the ghetto wall remain, standing as a reminder of the horrors that took place in the district. The plaque on this wall fragment reads, "Here they lived, suffered and died at the hands of the German torturers. From here they began their final journey to the death camps." During the German occupation, this building served as the only pharmacy in the Jewish ghetto and was run by the Polish pharmacist Tadeusz Pankiewicz, a non-Jew. He was the only non-Jew working in the ghetto. This square was at the heart of the Jewish ghetto. After Nazi occupation, the square was renamed the Ghetto Hero Square, and the Empty Chairs Memorial was made in honour of the Jews who died. I finished my second day in Krakow at the Museum of Modern Contemporary Art. It holds a vast amount of artwork from and about the Jewish ghetto in Krakow, as well as the impacts of the Holocaust on Poland. These etchings showcase events from the ghetto. This was one of my favourite pieces. They are flower cuttings from the BASILICA concentration camp I had visited earlier. The museum also has a cool section on sculptures and interactive artwork. The next video was recorded that night. I got back to the apartment, switched on the camera and just spoke. So it's a free flow of thought and emotion. It's raw, but it captures my feelings and I think it's important to watch. This is the end of my second day in Krakow in Poland, and I basically just wanted to put on video how today has made me feel, basically, because I've gone through quite a few emotions. So yesterday I did, I suppose, more of like the touristy thing, and I went to the old town and I went to the castle, and that's very much what all my research on Krakow had brought up, all of this sort of, go and see beautiful Krakow, this kind of stuff. But today, after having done a bit more of my own research, I decided I would go to, I believe it's called KAZIMIERZ, which is the Jewish, one of the Jewish districts in Krakow. And I wanted to go to the Galicia Jewish Museum, which I'd seen advertised. And if you are ever in Krakow, definitely go. It was absolutely brilliant. And I suppose in a way really reframed the Holocaust for me, being here in Krakow. I don't think I'd realised quite the extent of the impact World War II and specifically the Holocaust had on Krakow. But I didn't realise that Polish people were also really targeted, not just in terms of like the manual labour and concentration camps, but just in terms of being exiled from their own countries, essentially. So many of them were forced into other territories and communal living and all sorts. Really interesting, and I don't know why I didn't know this before. But the Galicia Museum really posed some very interesting questions. And it was about the idea that Jewish history and culture after the Holocaust had been very much eradicated or hidden or just sort of forgotten by communities in Poland. And I hadn't really thought about that before. But then when I was looking at the exhibitions there, most of them were very visual. And it was coming up with Krakow concentration camp. And I didn't even know Krakow had a concentration camp. So that in itself already felt like an erasure from their tourism. And all the touristic sites that I'd seen, none of them had said, go and visit the concentration camp that's in Krakow. They'd all said about Auschwitz. So after having seen that, I decided I would go there that afternoon. So I was already feeling quite emotional from the museum. I mean, it frames it brilliantly, and actually it ends on very much a high note, because it's about the reintegration of the Jewish community and culture into Poland. And so the final exhibition is just very celebratory, and it was lovely to end on that. But I learned a lot in the exhibition that, all of this is deeply unsettling. And sort of the quantity and the magnitude of the mass executions and the way that they were done really hit hard for me. I didn't realise quite the extent of them, or maybe didn't want to realise. But the exhibition is really good in terms of, it's basically a collection of photos of sort of the remnants of the Holocaust around Galicia, the area in Poland, whether that be references to synagogues or monuments in place of mass executions, all this sort of stuff. And next to it in the text box that explains the picture, it was written by a historian who's really passionate about this subject. But I find historians, I'm a historian, I study history, the labels can often be quite dry, but this was really just packed with, I was going to say emotion, but realistically the human element. And so one of the mass executions that the picture was talking about was of children, all children, and the text underneath it basically said something about how, you can imagine these children just running around unknowing of what's really happening to them and screaming and just the unknown. Whereas in a sense you can imagine that the adult executions were more I don't want to use the word dignified because they're not at all, but in terms of the adults generally knew what was coming, and so there wouldn't have been that sort of hysteria quite to the same extent. Yeah, I found that really, really tough. There's something very troubling about putting children into that context. But so after seeing this this exhibition in the museum and seeing Krakow come up so many times in the photos, I compiled a list of everywhere that it had mentioned and decided I would go and see it for myself, because I felt like in some small way I needed to pay my respect being here, and it almost felt wrong being here in Krakow and doing all the touristy things, taking pictures of all the beautiful buildings and architecture, and not going to the site of real horror. So I crossed the river and I went into another district of Krakow, which was where the Jewish ghetto was. And the Jewish ghetto, I didn't realise, was one of the biggest ones in the whole of the Holocaust. And that was based here in Krakow. And it was really interesting. I don't know if it actually is representative of wealth, but all the buildings were so run down. And I had read somewhere that after World War II, or after the ghetto was liquidated, what wasn't destroyed was basically left to ruin. But it was still like that now. All the buildings were still paint peeling, and I mean, I've got so many pictures, and you can see the comparisons between the two, between the old town, which is the sort of touristy part, versus the Jewish ghetto. And yeah, I couldn't get my head around the poverty that was still there. And also just how few tourists were there as well. Yeah, it really seemed to consolidate this idea from the museum earlier about the erasure of the Holocaust from current talk, I guess. But anyway, so I went in and went into this district and went to the concentration camp where it used to be. And on the way I walked past the LIBAN quarry, which is deserted now and you're not allowed to go in, but was used on the set of Schindler's List, which was the really famous film by Steven Spielberg, and was a fully functioning quarry of forced labour during World War II. And there was something very, very harrowing about it. You can see the whole quarry. And I already, there were some tourists there who had climbed down into the quarry and were taking those sort of typical Instagram pictures. And it really, really hurt me to see them doing that. I mean, I hope they didn't know what this quarry used to be. I hope they just thought it was an abandoned quarry. But it was just so disrespectful, so disrespectful. But I guess that's the danger, isn't it? Because there were no signs around explaining what it used to be. Why, I don't know. Is this the idea of erasure again? But anyway, so I continued on through the woods, which was actually really creepy. And no one was there, really. And came out into this big field, and this is where the concentration camp used to be. But now it's just a public park. So there were a few people around walking their dogs and things like that, but that was it. I think there's a collection of like 18 signs dotted around a huge area, because this concentration camp was really big. But yeah, as I say, 18 signs dotted around to commemorate what was, you know, an absolute atrocity. And I just felt like there needed to be more, so much more, to memorialise it and to honour those that had fallen there and, you know, been brutalised there. And it felt wrong. It felt wrong somehow to me. But yeah, so as I was walking around, like every now and then there'll be some rubble or like an old machine or a sort of fallen gravestone with no sign, with no explanation. And so of course you're left trying to piece it together, which in a sense is, well, I don't know if it is worse in this case. I think unbelievable things happened. But anyway, I was walking through, and on each of the signs it has a quote from someone, one of the prisoners who had been there, which of course immediately makes it so much more real. And there was something very spiritual, maybe, I'm not sure what word I would use, about being there, and there being no one around, nothing really left of it, and all you could hear was like birds and the wind like whistling through the dry bush that was around, and that was it. And it reminded me of something that I'd read in one of the museums, which was talking about nature being symbolic, how it is a constant. It's the only one that saw those monstrosities and survived it. And for me it very much felt like the nature had stood in time. And somehow in its silence was memorialising it, was remembering those who had lost their lives there, and those who survived it. And you can see the roll call area where they have their roll calls, and also some of their executions there. The ground is a very slightly different colour. Not sure why, no explanation, but yeah, you can really visualise it there. And there was something very powerful about that to me, because it was one of the only properly visual things left over that you could see for yourself and see the size of it and try to get an idea of the magnitude. Yeah. And then I walked to another area of the park where it's called the Grey House, and it's where the some of the Nazi personnel lived while it was the concentration camp, and the basement of which was a prison. And I'd read earlier on in the day that in Judaism, Jews will often put a pebble or a small rock next to something that they wish to remember. And there was a huge mountain of rocks next to this house. I suppose in a sense to remember what had happened here, to remember those that had fallen. And then next to it, there was just like a box there, I don't know what it was covering, with graffiti on it, and it had the Star of David with a cross through it. And I was just appalled, really speechless, which is why I'm struggling now. I don't understand how one can be so disrespectful in a place of such horror, especially. And I think it reminds me of something that I'd seen in the Galicia museum, where this woman who had survived Auschwitz, she came back after World War II to Krakow, and there was still a lot of anti-Semitism going on within Krakow, and this group of well, a mob essentially, was riled up and went after, I believe it was 6 Jews, one of whom was this woman, and for a few days basically rampaged their houses and threatened them, etc., etc., and eventually killed them. And there was something so shocking about that, because she had survived Auschwitz, she had survived it, the war was over, she was liberated, and then was killed for what end? For what end? And so this idea of anti-Semitism just really, really struck a chord with me, because I just couldn't understand it in that place. But so then I walked on and walked away, and went to a place where there's still a fragment of the ghetto wall still up, but there's only in 2 places, and on the wall it basically says, for all of those who have fallen here, etc., etc. I'll find the correct quote for it, because it's very moving. But yeah, this ghetto was atrocious, and thousands of Jews lost their lives there, whether from starvation or execution, all sorts. And if they didn't lose their lives from the ghetto, that was generally, when that ghetto was liquidated, they were sent off to concentration camps, where many of them also perished. And so there was this sort of finality about it. Their fate was sealed. They were going to die, whether it was in the ghetto or a concentration camp. And within the museums that I was going to, there were several personal records, and so many of them were saying how, you know, many contemplated suicide because it was easier than this, and yet the community that gathered together, there was a need to survive. If not for yourself, then for someone else, so that they had a reason to survive. And I just found that very moving. I then went to the factory, Schindler's factory from Schindler's List, and he basically was working with the Nazis, but was able to save over 1,000 Jewish people from the ghetto and from the concentration camps by enlisting them within his factory, which is amazing. But I wanted to go in, but unfortunately couldn't. There were no tickets left. So I thought, okay, I'm feeling very I don't know if vulnerable is the right word, feeling very raw about all of it. And so I went into the Contemporary Art Museum next door. I suppose in a sense just to take my mind off of it, get away from it. But the art museum, in fact, was all about the Holocaust as well. And there was something about it being an artwork where, you know, the artist has full liberty to be as graphic as they want and to really showcase it. And so that was actually incredibly hard as well, because it kind of put a picture to a lot of the things that I'd read about that day. And I don't know whether I had never been taught these things before or whether I had just chosen to forget them. But there seems to be a more open conversation about it in these museums. Yeah, I don't know whether I was just hidden from certain things growing up because I was too young to know them. But horrendous things. There was an account saying how when Jewish people were lined up to be taken to concentration camps, those who they knew wouldn't survive or wouldn't be helpful there were killed before they even left. So a lot of those were like the elderly, which I had heard about, but I hadn't really crossed my mind that it would also be babies. And so parents would literally have their babies taken from them and killed in front of them. And I won't go into how it was done, but not nice. And then the parents would be shipped off with the rest of their family to concentration camps to experience the ordeals there. Yeah, but then that was also put into paintings and etchings, and I really would recommend the Contemporary Art Museum. It was actually fantastic, although not quite what I was expecting. And I feel as though the museums also look at different aspects of it. It's not just you know, the ghetto or the concentration camps or just Auschwitz, which I think are all sort of the more well-known parts. But in part of this exhibition, it was talking about the professors from the university who were taken to concentration camps. And that was really fascinating as well, because I'd never heard about that side of it. You know, I probably in a textbook read that they were one among others who were taken, but never gone into detail. And it was brilliant, yeah, really, really interesting. In the Galicia exhibition, it said how anything on the Holocaust, whether it's a written piece or a picture, leaves you questioning. You know, how could this have been done as a state policy? How could normal humans go along with it and commit these atrocities? How could a God allow this to happen? And that certainly was going through my head a lot today. And I actually found it, I had on my list of things to do a Catholic church to go and visit, because supposedly it was very beautiful. And I found it really difficult to even go inside, actually, because, you know, this God that they were celebrating here had supposedly allowed all of these things to happen. yeah, I think it brings up a lot of questions. But then when I was at the concentration camp today, I felt like I needed to say a little prayer or a little something. And so I did. And it was really one of those happy coincidences, I suppose, but literally moments after I had. It's not been sunny today at all. The sun came through the clouds and literally lit up the concentration camp. Like, the ground was just flooded with light. And I don't know, it felt like that warmth of a blessing, or warmth of a... It had its recognition that I felt it wasn't having. But yeah, today was hard, very hard. But you know, I almost wonder whether people who live here, I don't know, because it is their history, their town's history, and for some of them their ancestors' history, and because remnants of it, if you look, are everywhere, have they become numb to it? Does it hit them the same? You know, in the same way as you might have something else around you in your life all the time, do you become normalised to it? I don't know. Because there were these beautiful apartments built up next to the concentration camp, which is now just a public park, but it has a really, really horrible history. And these beautiful apartments were built literally overlooking it. And I found that so peculiar, you know, who would want to live there? I just... But then if it's normalised, if it's just, it is a part of your history and you accept that, maybe you can. I don't know. But yeah, so Krakow Day 2 was very, very intense. And I'm going to Auschwitz tomorrow. So expect another one of these tomorrow, I guess.
And having done all of that, I decided even more so I wanted to see Auschwitz and stand there. I felt like I'd had a little glimpse of an understanding into it, or at least some of the background to the people who ended up there. So I booked onto a tour to go to Auschwitz the following day, and yeah, this is what happened.
I'm actually going to leave it there for today, guys. I think we could probably all do with a week's recovery after that one. Join me next week as I go to Auschwitz. I will give you its history and its impact on me. So if you like this video, please like and subscribe and keep following my journey.